Hello, and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast Series. My name is Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Tom Nightingale back to our podcast. Tom serves as CEO of AFS Logistics LLC, a 3PL and freight audit and payment company based down in Atlanta. Prior to joining AFS, Tom served as president and CEO of International Package Shipping and its operating companies. He's also held leadership roles at Genco, which is now FedEx Supply Chain, Modus Link, Conway, now known as XBO, and also Schneider National. Tom has a master's in business administration from Syracuse University and a bachelor's in marketing management from Siena College, and also serves on the board of several organizations, including Syracuse's Franklin Supply Chain Advisory Board, CSCMP, or the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, and formerly the Warehouse Education Research Council and Women in Trucking. Hey, Tom, welcome back.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be back.
Yeah, absolutely. And the timing is obviously good, Tom. There's a ton going on within the industries that you guys are focused on various fronts. But before we jump into sort of a line by line account of industry things, why don't we take a look sort of at what's happening when we look at things in regards to what I like to call the freight economy. So how things like consumer demand, retail sales, inventory levels, services, manufacturing output, and the like. How are those sort of mainstream economic metrics, in your opinion, impacting freight economy, volumes, tonnage, trends like that, things like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. And I would answer it in two ways. There's a kind of a today, and then there's a future. As I think about the freight economy today, it's really been somewhat disconnected from the overall economy over the past 20 months or so. While the Fed has done a good job during that time period and really appears to have us now headed for that proverbial soft landing, and that's kept consumer demand more or less at a slow simmer. The freight economy, on the other hand, has suffered because of the aftermath of this, let's just call it a bender that we were on during COVID. And what you've seen is inventories now have started to burn down, but they've burned down slower than anticipated because consumer demand has been okay. We've seen pent-up deliveries of equipment that was ordered during the pandemic and backlogged, and that's now hitting the truckload market. We're seeing, really, for all practical purposes, functionally defunct or bankrupt companies that have clung on to life, waiting for their financing costs to come down. So there's this inherent disconnect between where the economy has been in the past 20 months vis-a-vis where the freight market has been in the past 20 months. Now, if I look forward, it's a little bit of a different story. I think, if we look out toward the future, we've got the Fed expecting, 3 rate cuts this year. And we've got the CPI and the PCE both increasing in January and February. We've got future markets that are expecting the first rate cut to come in June, 75% probability on that. And the dot plot's also expecting 3 rate cuts. And then you look at projected GDP, that has now increased from a 1.4 to a 2.1, and retail sales growing 2.5 to 3.5%. So the future, at least on the surface, looks brighter. And we're starting to see some indication of that now in varying degrees across varying modes of transportation. So the PMI is now up, which is usually a great barometer for the LTL industry. The LMI is showing some good signs and some green shoots. And that sets us up for what should be a slightly more robust second half of 2024. Now, having said all that, I think that what we're seeing in our data, this TD Cowen AFS Freight Index that we publish each quarter, what we're seeing is a bit of a mixed bag. kind of by mode, it does vary. And what we're calling for in the next quarter is that parcel will really slyly attempt to hide price increases and claw back some of the increased labor and network rationalization costs that we've seen across the integrators. They're doing that really in the form of surcharges.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing LTL in the future being down a little bit in price, but relatively flattish, despite the fact that the LMI is showing some promise and the PMI is showing some promise. And then we're seeing truckload really just continuing to bump that bottom that we've seen really throughout the last 9 months. So the truckload sector, until more capacity comes out, just doesn't seem to be hitting that inflection point that we had thought might be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the index, just for those in the audience, that came out this week. And you make some great points, some great observations there, Tom. And one thing that definitely was highlighted in this current edition of the index was just how the wide array of accessorial charges that are being implemented, primarily in this case, where I'm talking about UPS and FedEx, or the big two, the parcel duopoly, if you will. Can you just share some examples of those accessorial charges and how, obviously you see the GRI. The GRI is is what's known as the general rate increase for our audience, but how the GRI clearly does not tell the full story. And I mean, there's a ton of information and a ton of detail on this in the report, which I encourage everyone listening into to check out. But can you just touch upon some examples of what's going on with those accessorial charges, Tom?
Absolutely. The real news this quarter, as you say correctly, is that the news was in parcel, and what we've seen is the volumes in parcel are down. We're seeing that as a result, predominantly of a result of consumer demand coming down as kind of that wage pressure and inflationary pressure hits the consumer's wallet. But concurrent to that, you've got UPS and FedEx who have increased costs. So they're trying to find really creative ways to recoup those costs. And just as an example, or a few examples for you, there were multiple increases in fuel surcharge, and in the expanded delivery area surcharge, just since the beginning of the year. So, for example, on the delivery area surcharge, those are surcharges associated with zip codes that are considered difficult or costly to access.
Mm-hmm.
And that is now more than half of the zip codes in the US that are somehow considered difficult or costly to access. They added 82 new zip codes since the beginning of the year, and 82 zip codes alone equated to 1% of the US population.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't seem proportional to me. On fuel, we've seen the ground fuel surcharge, which is typically based off of the on-highway diesel fuel index, and
Mm-hmm.
the express fuel surcharge, which is based on the Gulf Coast kerosene type jet fuel index. Those, in March, the jet fuel index was up 40%, but the express fuel surcharge somehow disconnected from that and went up 100%. Pretty big delta between that 40 and that 100.
Yeah.
Similarly, on ground diesel went up 22%, but the fuel surcharge went up 75%. So what we're seeing really on an ongoing basis is just an amazing level of sophistication on the part of the parcel carriers, and to a certain extent, the LTL carriers are starting to take a page out of that book, where they're trying to hide those increases in ways that the average shipper won't figure out. They won't see. They'll start to see their bill creeping up, but they won't necessarily be able to point to it because they're trying to look. The consumer, the actual shipper of UPS and FedEx's services, are more focused on those line haul charges than they are on the accessorials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty interesting to see. And that's a great point in regards to the delivery area surcharges not seeming proportional. 82 accounting for 1%. That's kind of wild. So let's shift gears for a minute, Tom. Obviously, tragic event recently in Baltimore involving the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. It'd be interested in getting your perspective on the impact of that situation in terms of how it's impacting supply chains, logistics operations, and how is AFS handling it, for example? Um, uh, I'd like to get what's happening there? I know we're still obviously it's still new. It's been less than 2 weeks, I think. So or maybe just over 2 weeks actually. What how has it been going from your perspective in terms of recovery efforts, logistics operations, things like that?
Yeah, and look, I'd be remiss if I didn't start off with extending mine and really the nation's condolences for such a tragic loss of life. And I think
Of course.
you know, to offer commentary is not meant to downplay the significance of that event for those that were adversely affected, with loss of life, or who are adversely affected through, providing services as supply chain professionals within that region. It is a tragic thing all the way around, and we're very, very sorry for everybody's losses there. However, having said that, you know, I'll answer your question more in a global context or more in a nationwide context than necessarily Baltimore specific.
Sure.
Baltimore overall, if you look at just based on tonnage, total tonnage, not necessarily containers, total tonnage, Baltimore is only ranked 18th in the country. So it's not a large port. And the other ports can and will effectively absorb that capacity. And they'll do it very, very quickly. It happens to have hit, as tragic as it is, at a time when the industry can handle the incremental demands. And I think it'll be felt more so in specific areas like roll on, roll off, or what's known as RoRo
Hmm.
and break bulk than it will be in container. And that may be a little bit counterintuitive for a lot of your listeners because, when you see a container ship causing the problem, you would think that it's a big container port. But the reality is that Baltimore is an 8-hour sail for a container ship to get to open water. So container ships really have been more focused on other ports of call that have higher net throughput, such as Charleston, New York, Savannah, et cetera. Baltimore has historically done very well in cars, bulk commodities, break bulk commodities such as paper and steel. So very little of that will necessarily affect the consumer like a containerized port would. If this were to happen in a major container port, it would be a very, very different situation. And I think at the end of the day, the broader issue is, why did it happen? How did it happen? What can we do to prevent it from happening again in
Hmm.
the future? And how does it fuel a dialogue, really a much needed dialogue about what is our national port strategy and how do we prevent these things from happening in the future at a more federal level than at the state level. Now, to come back to your question relative to the degree of adverse impacts, as you can probably infer from my prior comments, I don't think it's going to be that bad. I think we'll see freight diversion. I think we'll see some congestion arising from this, driven both by passenger and um, by truck traffic.
Hmm.
Now being jammed into other tunnels and bridges that they might not have used in the past. But Baltimore is centrally located, so those consumers can and will be served by other ports, whether it's Newport News, whether it's Virginia Beach, whether it's Wilmington, whether it's Charleston, whether it's New York. The demand will be met, and it will be probably a relatively non-event from a price problem. And as a matter of fact, I was just looking at some data this morning that indicates that ocean pricing has not risen, and it's actually gone down 1% in the past 2 weeks since
Ah,
this tragic event.
okay. Huh.
So, not necessarily causality, but on the other hand, at least a promising sign that that it's not driving any adverse impacts that we wouldn't have thought of. So in total, I don't want to say it's a non-event because that's an unfair characterization, but it is probably not the level of disruption that we would see from other more geopolitical events.
Okay, got it. And surely there's no shortage of geopolitical issues to monitor and keep an eye on. I'm thinking about things like the ongoing Red Sea situation. Not this geopolitical, but more weather related, obviously, Panama Canal. I mean, and last week's Taiwan earthquake. There's all kinds of global things to monitor. And I'm just wondering, with that as sort of a backdrop, Tom, how do you view sort of the concept of, I guess, supply chain resilience, uh, as we've been dealing with all kinds of different things going back really to March 2020 at the onset of the pandemic. Do you think shippers and also obviously logistics services providers like yourself have a better, more complete playbook now, sort of to deal with the unexpected, to be able to adjust and adapt to things that perhaps weren't uh forecasted initially, or really having to react and act? How do you sort of view that under that, within that lens, going back over the past few years?
Yeah, so I would actually even take us back further. I mean, the real big shock that I remember initially was when there was such dramatic flooding in Thailand, and it compromised the hard drive industry, because most of the hard drive industry was concentrated in Thailand. And it really started to send those shockwaves and got a dialogue started that has continued and probably accelerated as people have realized some of the associated risks with the lengthening of supply chain and the concentration of supply bases, which is a natural outcome because you have, concentration of resources, whether they be people or natural resources, that can provide certain services, in some cases actually government resources in the form of incentives, that tend to get into industries concentrated in a certain area. And I think, the talented supply chain professionals these days are looking at sourcing risks, and they are trying to mitigate those risks with multiple strategies. Some of them are nearshoring, or what you might hear as friendshoring. Some of them are just diversification of suppliers. And we are seeing an increase in the diversity of traffic. We're seeing a shortening of the overall length of haul as people try to get production and consumption closer to each other. So we're seeing that, both in the case of, reshoring to Mexico, we're seeing that in the length of haul, just even domestically. So things that maybe seem like good financial decisions, you might have saved a penny a widget in years past. Now all of a sudden you go, maybe that penny isn't really worth the risk. And I think the pandemic really put an exclamation point at the end of the sentence that started all the way back with flooding in Thailand. Gosh, that's got to be 15 plus years, 20 years ago at this point. So there's definitely a trend back to more localized production and consumption than we've seen in years past, and I think that will continue as logistics providers, as supply chain providers are more adept at helping people assess those risks and find ways to work around them.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And you just touched upon nearshoring. Earlier this year, it was reported that Mexico is now the United States' top trading partner, and we're seeing lots and lots of United States-based entities either setting up shop or expanding their presences over in Mexico and in Laredo, Texas, for that matter. How do you sort of view all of that under the guise? I mean, obviously, we have the USMCA, and and not to get too far off course, but we see it in the railroads too with CPKC and the end-to-end north to south connection, there or USMCA rail connection in a way. But with all that said, do you think how far along do you think we are in the whole Mexico specifically based nearshoring efforts. To borrow a baseball analogy, now that we're in baseball season, would you say we're in the early innings of this?
Yeah, well, I think the baseball analogy is particularly appropriate as a Red Sox fan. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I would say that we're in the early innings. I think we're probably, you know, there were many people who would have, 10 years ago said it was game over and everything was going to migrate to Asia. But really, we are now seeing a reshoring and a flow of activities coming back to the US that are, I think, particularly advantageous for certain providers. You mentioned the railroads, I think, are exceptionally well positioned in this space. And you're going to see probably the next, let's call it 7 innings for this thing to really fully mature. If we're at the top of the second, I
Yeah.
think that's probably even being a little bit generous. We might even be at the bottom of the first still
Okay.
in terms of reshoring.
And I mean, but so far, early into the game, are you what are you satisfied with the progress at this point? I mean, and you had just made a bunch of great points about sort of shortening lengths of haul and things like that. This all sort of really plays into that in various ways. It's hard not to overlook the potential. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that there is tremendous potential here. I think there are still very legitimate security risks associated with freight shipments in and out of the southern border.
Hmm.
I think that carriers and 3PLs and shippers need to be very much aware of them. Um, and there are inherent inefficiencies at the border that I think can be worked on over time. Having spent a fair amount of time at the border in my career, um, and experiencing those firsthand, I would say that we've got a lot of work to do to help really facilitate that trade as opposed to inhibit that trade. But I think that overall, carriers, customers, and 3PLs are making really good progress, and there's a real concerted effort to be there and be present and help make that market.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a couple more quick ones here, Tom, before we wrap up. Um, I was just sort of curious, and I'm looking ahead here a little bit, but we are in April, so not too far ahead. You at the outset of our call, we had talked about different aspects of the freight economy, and there were some really interesting takeaways there. Um, and it got me thinking a little bit, looking ahead on the calendar to the second half of the year where peak season efforts really fully get underway. Um, Last year seemed uneventful, I guess, largely in a good way relative to the few years prior, where early on in the pandemic, it was sort of like peak all the time. And then followed by services activity sort of taking over, leading to more depressed peaks. How do you think things may be lining up for 2024 peak season?
It's pretty early to call that one at this stage. I
Hmm.
would say that it will be relatively comparable to what we saw last year.
Okay.
Um, Peak season, particularly on the truckload side of things and the ocean side of things, and we don't have tremendous visibility into the ocean world. We have some. I believe we're roughly $750 million in ocean freight that we audit and pay.
Okay.
So we get some visibility, but compared to the overall market, I wouldn't consider this be our core competency. I would tell you as an armchair observer in that space, I think the ocean sector has excess capacity now and can absorb any kind of peak that the overarching economy would throw at it. I don't think that the overarching economy is going to throw a tremendous amount of demand. Even if we get those 3 rate reductions, it's going to take a little bit of time for the consumer to snap back. And
Sure.
I don't see a massive snapback in holiday season orders or pre orders in advance of the overall economy coming back. I think that people are going to be a little bit guarded. I think fuel is going to continue to eat away at their wallets. I think that variable rate mortgages are going to continue to eat away at the consumers' wallets. And I think the procurement professionals who really drive that peak season are pretty keenly attuned to how the consumer is feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the consumer is still a little bit cheapish. They're a little bit concerned. They're a little bit reluctant or reticent to go out and make a lot of really big purchases. So I think that it'll be a somewhat muted peak, probably not compared to last year, but certainly compared to the years prior. And that will affect both the ocean, the rail, and the truckload sector in the form of, I think, their ability to just absorb that without breaking a sweat.
Got it. Got it. And last one before we wrap up, Tom, and it sort of circles back to the AFS, the Cowan AFS index. Um, I was wanting to touch upon truckload for a quick minute in terms of the truckload capacity outlook. Obviously, there has been available capacity. Things aren't nearly as tight as we've seen them in the past. You see different data regarding spot market activity, whether it's from DAT, truck stop, et cetera. Um, things have kind of been bumping along, if you will. Um, how do you view sort of the current state of truckload capacity and how it may be looking over the course of Q2? We don't want to look too far ahead on that.
Yeah, so I think that the truck well, what we saw in from Q4 to Q1 was the rate per mile fell slightly. The cost per shipment continued to come down during that same time period. Some of that driven by shorter length of haul, and some of that driven by average line haul cost.
Mm-hmm.
Over the next couple months, as we look out the next quarter, we expect that the rate per mile will continue to bounce along that floor that I mentioned before that we established in Q1. I think there'll be a slight decline from Q1 to Q2, but it is worth noting that Q2, I believe, will be the first year that we've seen an increase in Q2, a quarter over quarter increase since Q3 of 2022. So we're not, it's not doom and gloom, but it's certainly not, let's break out the cupcakes and have a party kind of thing. So I think Q2 will be bumping along the bottom with a slight ray of hope relative to a year over year comparison. And Q3 and 4 are to be determined, but probably not materially upticking, just hopefully hitting some kind of an inflection point that puts us on a positive glide path.
Okay, got it. Got it. Understood. All right, listen, Tom, this brings us to the end of our allotted time for today's podcast. So, on behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd like to offer up a big thank you for joining us again today. I believe this is a second time you've joined us on the LM podcast series. So, thanks for that.
It is, and it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you got it. And for those in the audience that want to see or learn a bit more about AFS Logistics, just go ahead and check them out on LinkedIn. Just go ahead on LinkedIn and enter all one word, AFS Logistics. And for those of you on Twitter, please feel free to go ahead and give us a follow. It's simply at LogisticsMGMT. And also, please feel free to go ahead and subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Just go look for Supply Chain 24/7. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day, and we'll talk to you next time.